All right, welcome everybody. Are you ready for some climate science? All right, that's a little better. Well, we have a great lineup tonight. Our topic, meeting global energy needs without cooking the planet. We have a lineup of three great panelists from various sectors of global energy. As I've probably mentioned to you all before, my name is Sean McDonald and I am the MC for tonight's event. The event tonight, we're going to try to give you a new understanding of the magnitude of the global challenge of decarbonizing our energy system. We're hoping to give you a better understanding of the nuances of the trade-offs associated with all of our clean energy options, and also to get you excited about the portfolio of clean energy options and sources that can be employed where they make sense. Our first panelist tonight, James Conca. James Conca obtained a PhD in geochemistry from the California Institute of Technology, an MS in planetary science, and a BS in geology and biology from Brown University. James is a senior scientist for UFA Ventures Incorporated in Tri-Cities, Washington. He's affiliate scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's also adjunct at WSU. I won't hold that against you. And trustee of the Herbert M. Parker Foundation. He's a science contributor to Forbes on energy and environmental issues, and Jim combines the passion of activism with 35 years career as a research scientist to create a new dynamic for discussing complex topics like energy and its effects on society and the planet. Without further ado, let's hear it for James Conca.
I love these NASA nighttime shots because you can tell right away who has energy and who doesn't. That's what the fighting's all about. That's what it's always been about, and it will continue to be about. Right now, this is the result of generating about 20 trillion kilowatt hours a year. It's a good round number. Keep it in mind, because it's going to get a lot bigger. Now, this is the distribution of energy by type. So the world is 2/3 fossil fuel, and 1/3 split almost evenly between nuclear and hydro. It's been that way for 40 years. It will continue to be that way unless we make some radical changes. I split it up into electricity or power and transportation, because right now they are not coupled. Transportation is dominated by petroleum, oil, and diesel, jet fuel and things like that. It's not coupled, they need to be coupled. The only way to significantly make an inroad into cutting petroleum is to go to fully electric vehicles, period. Not hydrogen, not anything else. You gotta go to fully electric vehicles if you can have any hope. Now, the United States is also about 2/3 fossil fuel, a little bit more nuclear, a little less hydro. But it depends on where you live, of course. Washington, of course, is the least carbon footprint of any state. It's almost the least carbon footprint of any civilized nation in the world because of hydro, nuclear, wind, and a little bit of other. We only have one coal plant. It's going to be closing soon. And that'll significantly cut our energy sector footprint. European Union, a little bit more nuclear because of France, a little less hydro. Korea, significant nuclear. China doesn't look like much, but China is planning 400 new nuclear power plants by 2050. They're breaking ground at a new nuclear plant every month. Now, this is the world power consumption growth curve. It's very steep. It has nothing to do with us. Again, we're presently at 20 trillion. We're still around 4 trillion. We're kind of flat. We're not growing very much. In order to address any of the environmental issues we talk about, we say we care about, we're going to have to come up with about 20 trillion kilowatt hours in non-fossil fuel. That's the big question. How can you come up with 20 trillion kilowatt hours from non-fossil fuel? That's more than we produce now, or just about what we produce now. Now, this is the reason that curve is so steep. There are 1.2 billion people still have no access to electricity whatsoever. 2.4 billion people still burn wood manure as their main source of energy, and 3 billion more people are coming on board by 2040. That's a lot of people. It takes about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to have what we consider a good life, to lift someone out of poverty and into what we call the middle class. About 3,000, that's it. We've known this for decades. I encourage you to visit the United Nations Human Development Index, UNHDI. This is no secret. We've known for years that access to energy is the first term in the happiness equation, truly. If you do not have enough energy, it's really hard to have what we consider a good life. So we have two groups in the world right now. We have us and the haves. Of course, we talk about energy here, we talk about moving us down that way, compact fluorescence, hybrid electrics, that's great. These people have no energy to conserve. So you have to move us down, sure, but you have to move these people up. If you're below 0.8 on the Human Development Index, Really hard to have a good life. If you're below 0.4, things are really bad. You spend about 6 hours a day getting water. Now, China's kind of bizarre here because China's in two parts now. Since 1992, when they shook off the vestiges of the Cultural Revolution, their Politburo became 80% scientists and engineers. 1992, 80%. And they knew this relationship, so they said, we're going to build 600 coal-fired power plants beginning in 1992, and by 2010, they built 600 coal-fired power plants. And they created 500 million middle-class Chinese. All of their policies now are lifting these 800 million still in abject poverty up into the middle class by mid-century, and they will do that. So they will have 1 billion middle-class Chinese by mid-century. The question is, how are they going to give that energy? Is it going to be more coal? They're just building everything. They're building 200 new coal plants, 200 new gas plants, 400 new nuclear power plants, and more renewables than anyone else. They simply need that much energy to eradicate global poverty. Canada's big and cold. Too bad, you're stuck. You'll never get down because it's big and cold. But there's not that many people there, so you're not going to affect global issues. You need to affect global issues by affecting the lives of billions of people, not a few million. So we need to cut us down to 6K. We need to keep people that have 3K there. We need to bring 4 billion and 3 billion coming on board up to 3,000, and that's going to take an additional 21 trillion kilowatt hours. So the minimum amount of energy to eradicate global poverty and its evil stepchildren, war and terrorism, is to come up with 30 trillion kilowatt hours of energy a year. That's a minimum, okay? And all COP21 was about, all any climate change meeting is about, is how to give these people that much energy without giving them coal. That's the main question, and who's going to pay for it? Now here's climate change for the last 500 million years. I apologize for the busyness of this slide. So this is thousands of years, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. What should jump out at you right away is we have been in an extremely cold period for the last 10 million years. So much so the last 2.3 million years we've had glaciation, which is an odd thing on Earth. Very hard to get glaciers on Earth. You need land masses at the poles, and you need a bunch of other astronomical geometry to occur, but we have been very cold. We're just coming out of it rather fast. So you probably hear people say, well, it's been warmer in the past, right? No big deal. There's been a lot more CO2 in the past, no big deal. Well, yeah, it's a big deal because it's the rate of change that matters. The absolute temperature has no effect on anything. It's the rate of change. So when you change too fast, you die, and that's called extinction. It's no big deal because it happens all the time. Unless you're the one being extincted, then it's not so cool. So this is the problem here. We've been a lot warm in the past. We have been very cold recently, and we are coming out of it too fast. We were coming out of it anyway, but humans exacerbated quite a lot, and that's the whole point. There are two models that climate scientists look at. You've probably heard of them, A2 and B1. So A2 is business as usual. We're still going to be 2/3 fossil fuel by the end of the century. We might have a little bit more gas and coal, but we're still going to be 2/3 fossil fuel. So that means we're still going to be, increasing about 7, 8, 9 degrees. B1 is we do everything we possibly can. We do everything we can. That's not particularly great. It's better, but it's not great. So everything we do now is we pretty much, how close do we want to be to these two end members? And that's our choice. This is the urgency. You have to decrease global emissions significantly by 2040 to 2050. Now, we could have done that in 2011, only decreased by 4% a year. That's still dramatic, but we blew that one. Okay, so 2015 came around, we needed now to decrease by 5% a year. Well, we blew that one. Now it's coming up to 2020. Now we're going to have to decrease 9% per year. How much have we decreased? 0 is a good answer for that kind of thing. We flattened out, but we are not decreasing yet. And if we don't decrease, then this is what the tipping point is. We keep tipping, go vertical, and then there's no chance to make it. So that's the urgency. What's the fastest growing energy source in the world? Shout it out. Coal. Sorry, bummer. Yes, Asia. Because it turns out if you're a poor country and you have no infrastructure to speak of, coal is all you can do. That's why the climate meetings are who's going to pay for this, because you have to pay to not do coal, because it's the only one you can do. You have no pipelines, you have no high voltage lines, you have nothing. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Jim. Jim gave us a great introduction to the issue. John Chandler is the technical lead of water resources at Puget Sound Energy. He has been a water manager of 620 billion gallons of water per year at a 200 megawatt electric facility since 2014. Sounds like a math problem in the SAT. John is a licensed professional engineer in Washington State and received his MS in Environmental and Water Resources Engineering in 2008 from the University of Maine. In graduate school, John studied the output from global climate models used in the IPCC to help understand how the hydrology of Western North America might be affected by climate change. When he's not working, John enjoys dancing, playing Magic the Gathering, hiking, and ultimate frisbee. And I should note that John is not here as a representative of PSE today, so if you have a problem with your bill, do not come and talk to John. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to John Chandler.
Now that Jim's given us some idea of how much power we're going to need, I'm going to talk about some of the trade-offs that we're going to have to consider going forward and some perhaps pretty difficult decisions we're going to have to make. And just to echo what Sean just said, I'm not here as a representative of my employer, Puget Sound Energy. So if you get mad at me. And one of the big things that we want to get across in the panel today is that there are many different paths to decarbonization, and what works for one place isn't necessarily going to work for another. This figure here shows the non-carbon electric power generation for 5 different states. So here we go with Illinois. They have a lot of nuclear, a little bit of wind, and a sliver of hydro. Whereas here in Washington, we have a very different mix with a lot of hydro, a little bit of wind, and a little bit of nuclear. So there are many different ways to get there in solving this problem, and it's going to vary regionally as to what makes the most sense. And for today's discussion, there's basically going to be 2 different kinds of hydro. One is run of river, where there's basically no lake behind it, there's basically no storage. The other one are bigger projects that have a reservoir behind them, and that reservoir basically acts as a battery, as stored potential energy that you can use when you want it. And that type of flexibility is extremely important, particularly when we're talking about power production for keeping your lights on. I'm a pretty big fan of hydro, but I tried to be fair with this table. Some of the pros and cons of hydro, and I'll just highlight a few of each. I totally understand people's reservations about it. A few of the things that people often aren't a big fan of are some of the environmental impacts downstream. Some of those can be mitigated to a certain degree. One of the things that comes up a lot in emissions discussions are potential methane emissions from reservoirs. That tends to be a bigger problem in tropical areas with shallow lakes, but the science on that is evolving. Finally, like every structure ever built, they can fail. And when they fail, they can have a lot of impact. I mean, all I can say about that is there's a lot of professionals all over the nation and the world who are, their entire job is making sure that doesn't happen. There are a lot of benefits, though, from hydro. For example, flood management, storing water for irrigation, water supply, and you can store water and let it out to benefit the environment during droughts, something I had experience with in 2015. Hydro has the flexibility to balance wind and solar, which is extremely important right now. Final one we'll highlight for now is the longevity of these projects. Like, for example, Hoover Dam could easily be there 10,000 years from now. Some of these larger concrete structures can last for centuries or millennia. That's not something you're going to see from too many other resources. Here in Washington, it varies from year to year, but about 2/3 of our electrical power comes from hydro. There's about 1/3 of our overall energy use. We're blessed with the Columbia River Basin and a bunch of other sizable rivers we can use for power production. Nationwide, it's about 6 to 7% of our overall power production, or about 3% of our overall energy use. Something most folks don't know is only about 3% of our 80,000 dams in America currently have hydropower capacity. The Department of Energy estimates there's about 65 gigawatts of capacity without building any new dams, which would almost double the conventional hydro in the United States. And this figure shows where many of them are located. Now, grid reliability is a really important aspect of this that we don't talk about nearly enough, in my opinion. Power is being taken off of the grid at a certain rate that varies, minute to minute, hour to hour. And utilities like mine and others have to put power on the same amount to balance it. If that balance gets too far out of whack, you have reliability problems. There's a lot of regulations in place, particularly in the United States, to keep that from getting too far out. But basically what this means is your two flexible resources that are used right now are hydro and natural gas. So those are backing up things like wind. So you'll have your hydro and natural gas generating along, then wind will come up, your hydro and natural gas will go down to balance it, and then when the wind turns back off, the hydro and natural gas will come back up to match it. That's kind of the limit on the wind and solar that you can have on the system. That's why you can't have 100% wind and solar right now, because you don't have the ability to balance it. Our ability to do that should get better. Batteries are going to play a much bigger role in this going forward. I also understand that nuclear has the ability to do this, particularly the newer models. Another important part of this discussion is transmission. If you're building a wind farm or a solar farm, they're often pretty far away from existing infrastructure. So you have to build transmission lines, build infrastructure out to them. Not everybody's a big fan of that. But that's one of those things. If you want this renewable energy, you're going to have to build the infrastructure to support it. Now to wrap up, meeting our energy needs while decarbonizing is going to be a team effort. There's no one resource that's going to fix everything, everywhere, all the time. In my opinion, we're probably going to end up with a mix of wind, solar, hydro, batteries, nuclear, energy efficiency, conservation, perhaps some geothermal. And they're going to vary in amounts from place to place according to what they have and what they can support. And with that, thank you very much. I'll see you in the panel.
We're going to move on to our final speaker, our final panelist speaker, before we move on to the moderated discussion. That's Scott Montgomery. Scott is an author, geoscientist, and affiliate faculty member in the UW-Jackson School of International Studies. For more than 2 decades, Scott has worked as a geoscientist in the energy industry, writing over 100 scientific papers and 70 monographs on topics related to oil and gas, energy technology, and industry trends. That's a lot of writing. I wish I was that prolific. He's also the author of 12 books and writes and lectures on a wide variety of topics related to global energy, geopolitics, technology, resources, and climate change. He is a frequent contributor to online journals such as The Conversation, Forbes, and Fortune, and his articles and op-eds are regularly featured in many outlets including Newsweek, MarketWatch, and the Huffington Post. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Scott Montgomery.
Thank you very much. The first slide is going to talk to you more than I need to. This gives you a very direct idea of exactly what Jim started out by saying. There is real energy poverty in the world. There are enormous differences between developing countries and advanced countries. And as you can see from the upper left-hand image, there is real willpower in the developing world to change that. So in the next several decades, we are going to see hundreds of millions of more vehicles on the roads of developing countries. The demand for transportation is enormous, and it is concentrated in the developing world, the emerging economies. Oil feeds every form of transportation that exists on the planet today, from jets to leaf blowers. From the point of view of international studies, one of the most important things is that it feeds every military. No country has a military today without a dependence on oil. And this makes oil a national security issue for every single country, including those that have it, including the Middle East, or Russia, or that other huge malfunctioning corporation that we call the United States. Because we have really changed. We are in the midst of an oil boom right now, very interesting situation. The equation for change is something we know. There are actually more than one different equations here in terms of reducing our dependence on oil. This is the one that has been mentioned the most, non-carbon. So renewable energy, including hydro, nuclear energy, from which the US gets 60% of its non-carbon electricity today, and these together should reduce the total amount of oil. So the equation looks fairly simple, especially when I show it to you in pictures like this. But the road to there is not simple. I show you this graph here that is from your favorite oil company besides Exxon, which is BP, that we all know from the Gulf Coast, Deepwater Horizon. Actually, BP is one of the most forward-looking renewables proposing oil companies in the world today, in as much as oil companies do that. It's not an accident that the ones who do this the most are from Europe and not necessarily from the United States. What I want to draw your attention to here is this bottom portion. So this is a prediction by BP. All oil companies do this, by the way. They always look at least 20 years ahead. They always need to look decades ahead. Big corporations do this in general, but the oil companies do it almost as a reflex. So they produce these reports. BP's been doing it for 65 years and making it available for free. They're quite interesting to look through. They do not agree with each other. Shell's does not agree with Exxon's, does not agree with Total's, etc. I choose BP's because people pay attention to it. And sometimes they base policy decisions on BP's analyses. What I want to call your attention to here are the increases. These are fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. What you notice is that coal actually peaks, not very far from now, even within the first few years of the next decade. Natural gas increases enormously. A great deal of that increase is due to climate policy. And oil keeps rising, slowly but steadily. There is a reason for that. We do not have any alternatives to oil. There are no global scale alternatives to petroleum fuels anywhere. We are working on some. We are praying for some. And some people believe that they exist, but they don't. And if you don't believe me, you can talk to anybody in the military, and they will inform you differently. But we are still living as hydrocarbon people in a hydrocarbon world when we talk about transportation. And that is not going to change for decades. That is what this graph shows. Not only does it show an increase in consumption and demand, it shows an increase in supply. Because as I mentioned before, we are in the midst of an oil boom in the United States. Recently, the US has been evaluated by at least one international think tank as having as much oil reserves as Saudi Arabia, believe it or not. And this is mostly due to the fracking revolution. So the point is, there is a lot of oil in the world today. And that is an important point. But the point I want to make is that it's not going to be a nice, easy, level playing field going forward. Let's talk about cars, because you've heard a lot about electric cars. So I looked around and tried to find two very optimistic estimates, and I did. The first one is from the International Energy Agency, which is a big think tank for all the wealthy countries, the OECD. And their estimate is that by 2040, there will be about 280 million electric cars on the road. That's 280 million out of about more than 1 billion. The most positive or optimistic estimate that I've seen is by Mr. Bloomberg. His organization, by 2040 predicts 33% of total cars sold and owned will be EVs. 33%, that's pretty good, that's a lot. That's 580 million cars, but that's out of 1.6 billion cars. So what we're seeing is that electric cars are not going to rule the transportation world of private mobility, even by mid-century. So we got a problem. Oil is a very, very serious challenge for the future. It doesn't even matter if we get all of those other renewable and non-carbon, including nuclear, energy sources, electricity sources we won't be able to make and sell enough EVs by mid-century. That's the prediction, okay, that's a prediction. Predictions can be worth what you pay for them, or they can be very important guides for policy and for the future. So at this point, I think it's important for us just to review some of the main points I made. Because these are the points that make oil the great challenge that it is. Remember this, we are without real alternatives. That is the pinch in the hourglass right now. And oil is the second most carbon-rich fuel that we use after coal. Demand is rising for oil, but so is abundance. What does that mean? That means that the market can be supplied to the degree that the price will not go sky high. Why is that important? Because when the price does go sky high, change happens much more quickly. We saw this in 2008 when the price went to $147 a barrel. We saw it in Seattle in the next year when the price was skimming $4 for gasoline. People were riding in cars together, a little bit more, much higher ridership, buses, more bicycles. Change can happen very rapidly, but economics has a real role to play. So we don't know if that's going to happen with oil, okay? But it does not look like that will be a driving force. Policy by the government and choices by all of you and me, consumer choice becomes very, very important. EVs are the future. They are the long-term and maybe the mid-term future, but they have to replace a $20 trillion petroleum system from extraction to use, and that's going to take time. We do have options, and we'll talk about those during the moderated session, okay? Those options require trade-offs, but we do have other ways of making a difference, and we need to do it in this state. Because transportation, as you know, is the major source of our carbon emissions and pollution. Thank you very much for listening.